Good evening. Good
Good
evening.
evening.
I know Whitney does it better, right? So we don't have to. Everybody, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. I'm Carol Kinnair, Director of Communications for the UMass Amherst Libraries. Welcome, finally, to the 28th Annual W.E.B. Du Bois Lecture. The event was due to take place, of course, on Du Bois's birthday on the 23rd, but New England weather didn't cooperate. So campus was eventually closed that day. So we want to thank Chad and everyone here and everyone online for being patient and letting us reschedule and not cancel. So we're very, very grateful. And now I want to acknowledge the land on which we are situated. The University of Massachusetts Amherst acknowledges that it was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation, on the land of the Norwatic community. We begin with gratitude for nearby waters and lands. We recognize these lands and waters as important relations with which we are all interconnected and depend on to sustain our life and well-being. The Pocumtuck had connections with these lands for millennia, and for over 400 years of colonization, when Pocumtuck peoples were displaced, many joined their Algonquin relatives to the east, south, west, and north. That includes Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Mohegan, Pequot, Mohican, all their communities, and the Abenaki and other nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. These native people still maintain connections and relationships and care for these lands today. We also acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts is a land-grant university as part of the Moral Land Grant Act. Portions of land from 82 Native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. As an active first step toward decolonization, we encourage you to learn more about the Native nations whose homelands UMass Amherst now resides on, and the indigenous homelands on which you live and work. We also invite you to deepen your relationship to these living lands and waters. The annual lecture, as well as other events organized by the Du Bois Center, are made possible by the generous support of our donors, and I'm proud that includes me. I looked up my record, my first gift was in 2011. I invite you to join me and make a gift to the center, which goes towards supporting programming and the creation of new scholarship through postdoctoral and graduate fellowships, and also does things like this wonderful timeline that we were able to bring to the space recently. Whether you are here tonight in the room with us or online, we invite you to keep up with all our goings-on at the Du Bois Center by signing up for our mailing list. And if you're watching on live stream, you'll find links to both donation page and mailing list in the video description. Next, I'd like to introduce someone who, since first setting foot on this campus, has striven to support the Du Bois Center and its many programs and initiatives for which we are very, very grateful. Here to introduce our distinguished Du Bois lecturer is Dr. Nandita Manning, Dean of University Libraries. Thank you.
I would first like to thank the WEB Du Bois Center staff, Adam Holmes, our Assistant Director, and Whitney Battle-Baptiste, who unfortunately could not be here today, but I know her thoughts are with us, and she's so excited that we could all hold our event today. A huge thanks to the library's development and communications team, who's involved in planning, organizing, promoting, and reporting this event. So Carol Kinnair, Kim Phil, Leslie Shaler, Josh Silver, and Lauren Weitz. Also, thank you to our partners across campus in the Provost's office and the Departments of History, English, Sociology, Anthropology, Political Science, and of course, the WEB Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. We would like to pause briefly here to pay tribute to one of the founders of the Department of Afro-American Studies who sadly passed away last month. John Bracey was a civil rights activist, a pillar of the community, and a faculty member at UMass Amherst since 1972. He helped create the Afro-American Studies Department and bring luminaries such as Betty Shabazz and James Baldwin to UMass. He was also an early and continuous advocate of the WEB Du Bois Center. Professor Bracey was a tireless advocate for equality and justice on our campus and beyond, and a generous teacher and mentor to his students. He leaves behind an immense legacy, having changed this campus for the better. A tribute to his life is being planned for later this year. And now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Chad Williams, who is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University, who earned a BA with honors in history and African American Studies from UCLA and received both his MA and PhD in history from Princeton University. Dr. Williams specializes in African American and modern United States history, African American military history, and African American intellectual history. He's widely recognized as one of the nation's foremost scholars on African Americans in World War I. His upcoming book, The Wounded World, W.E. Du Bois and the First World War, will be published in 2023 and is the subject of tonight's lecture. We are honored to have Dr. Williams as our speaker for the 28th annual W.E.B. Du Bois Lecture at UMass Amherst, so please join me with a warm welcome to Dr. Williams.
Thank you everyone for being here this evening. It is a tremendous privilege and a tremendous honor to be amongst the distinguished names who have presented as part of the Du Bois Lecture. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for indulging us with the rescheduling. The weather cooperated this time, so glad about that. Thank you everyone for joining us via the live stream. Thank you, Deeman, for that very generous introduction. I'd like to second her gratitude to everyone in the library for all of your work, commitment to preserving Du Bois's legacy, especially in special collections. I'd like to thank everyone affiliated with the Du Bois Center, Whitney, who unfortunately cannot be here, Adam, thank you for all of your work, leadership. Really appreciate all of your hospitality in bringing me here this evening. I also want to second Dean Manny's very heartfelt comments regarding John Bracey and send my deepest condolences to the entire community of the Department of Afro-American Studies and all of his colleagues. John was truly a giant in African American studies, and I know that he is with us in spirit today. So let me make sure that this is on. All right. Hopefully we are good to go. Okay, here we are. I know the moment of truth, right? I appreciated the pause right before we came on. So this evening I'm going to tell a story. It's a story about war and the challenges of being African American. It's a story about race and democracy, about history and memory. It's a story about hope and disillusionment, faith and tragedy, determination and failure. It's a story that spans more than 2 decades, from one world war to the next, and features as its central character arguably the most significant Black intellectual in American history. But for me, the story actually starts right here, on this campus, in this library, in October of 2000. I just started research for my dissertation, what would become my first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, and was visiting UMass Amherst. Right? As we all know, the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois are housed. So I had very responsibly, in advance, gone through the finding aid and saw a reference to Du Bois' World War I materials. Now, I didn't know what it was, but I was certainly intrigued. So, on a beautiful, picturesque fall day, I go to the towering Du Bois library. I go to the special collections desk, And I asked the archivist, can I see this Du Bois World War I materials? I didn't know what it was, maybe a collection of newspapers, some articles, I had no idea. The archivist returns with 6 microfilm reels. So now, I'm really intrigued. What could this possibly be? So, I load the microfilm reel. Remember what microfilm was? You have to crank it and, get to the first frame, and this is what I saw. What I was looking at was the table of contents of an unfinished and unpublished manuscript by W.E.B. Du Bois on the Black experience in World War I. This was followed by the actual manuscript, along with all of Du Bois's research materials and correspondence related to the project. Needless to say, I was shocked, thrilled, overwhelmed, all types of emotions running through me, but I was also, in all honesty, confused. What was I looking at? I had so many questions. As I began to immerse myself in this archive and learn more about it, I realized that it was not completely unknown. It was, after all, a microfilm copy, and the original materials were located at Fisk University. Some Du Bois scholars, most notably David Lewis, had discussed it to some extent in their works. But most people, when I tell them about Du Bois's unpublished manuscript, they're just as surprised as I was that day in October of 2000. Now, why this is the case, given all that has been written about Du Bois, would indeed be a fascinating story to tell, and one maybe that I'll get to at some point. But what I'm really interested in is the story behind this book. What happened? Why did Du Bois write it? What was this book about? How long did he work on it? Why did it remain incomplete and unpublished? And ultimately, why is it important? So, as best I can in the next half hour or so, let me tell you the story based on my forthcoming book, available for pre-order now. Actually comes out April 4th, right? Less than 2 weeks. The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War. So I'm assuming that for the purposes of this talk and for this audience, Du Bois really needs no introduction. But I will just emphasize that during the years of the First World War, Du Bois was at the height of his influence, arguably the most widely recognized and respected spokesperson for African Americans. This was certainly reflected on the occasion of his 50th birthday, when he was feted and presented with a silver cup inscribed with a message from the branches of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People to W.E. Burghardt Du Bois, writer, scholar, seer, on his 50th birthday, February 23rd, 1918. Given an affectionate appreciation of his great gifts and gratitude for the consecration of these gifts to the service of his race. Du Bois closely followed the World War from the opening guns of August 1914. Yet, in a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. He wrote in his landmark 1915 Atlantic Monthly article, The African Roots of War. He pinpointed the origins of the conflict in the competition amongst the European belligerents for imperial control of Africa and its people. France, England, Belgium, they all had blood on their hands. But thirsty for global domination, Germany, in Du Bois's opinion, posed a grave threat to the world's darker races. The Allies had to win. So when Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress on April 2nd, 1917, and declared war on Germany, Du Bois, setting aside his pacifist principles, was not opposed to the United States entering the conflict. He argued that it presented an opportunity for African Americans to stake claim to their citizenship and bring meaning to Wilson's claim that the world must be made safe for democracy. Black people had fought in the past And now they would do so again, with the hopes that the two warring ideals of being Black and of being American that Du Bois famously articulated in The Souls of Black Folk would at last be reconciled. Du Bois threw himself into the war effort, encouraging African Americans as soldiers and as civilians to demonstrate their loyalty on and off of the battlefield. But white supremacy tested his patriotism. Along with other African Americans, he had to reckon with moments like the unjust execution of 13 soldiers following a racial shootout in Houston, Texas, and especially the East St. Louis pogrom of July 1917, which left hundreds of Black people dead. While African Americans certainly pleaded for Woodrow Wilson to make America safe for democracy, they also demanded it, as evidenced by the silent protest parade in response to the East St. Louis massacre, with Du Bois marching in the front next to James Wilbur Johnson. So when Joel Spina, former chairman of the NAACP and one of Du Bois's closest friends, approached him in early June of 1918 with an offer to become a captain in the War Department's Military Intelligence Division. The Military Intelligence Division. Du Bois had a momentous and potentially career-defining choice to make. Du Bois knew that this appointment would arouse suspicions, but he believed that, as he wrote in a letter to the director of military intelligence, his decision to accept the offer reflected, in his words, no inconsistency with or change of attitude from my lifelong work and opinions. Indeed, he viewed his attitude as, in his words, one of far-reaching patriotism. But just to make sure no lingering reservations existed about his loyalty, he wrote close ranks for the July issue of the Crisis. The Great War represented the crisis of the world, Du Bois began. He argued that however distant the war seemed, Black people had no ordinary interest in the outcome. For this reason, African Americans had to make their allegiances clear. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills. Closed ranks unleashed a firestorm of criticism. The Boston civil rights activist and one-time ally of Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, among other insults, labeled Du Bois a rank quitter of the fight for rights. From coast to coast, many African Americans branded Du Bois as self-serving at best, and at worst, a traitor to the race. For a man who had committed his life to the cause of freedom and justice for Black people, to the upliftment of the race, no charge could be more hurtful. The captaincy offer ultimately crumbled, but the uproar and damage to his radical credentials left Du Bois deeply wounded. Du Bois's attempt to strike a grand bargain with the federal government and American democracy seemed yet more misguided in light of the U.S. military's treatment of Black servicemen. Approximately 380,000 African American soldiers served in the racially segregated United States Army. The majority of Black troops in France unglamorously labored in the services of supply, loading and unloading ships, digging ditches, burying dead bodies. The Army reluctantly agreed to the creation of two Black combat units, the 92nd Division, composed of draftees, and the 93rd Division, made up largely of Black National Guardsmen. While the 93rd Division compiled a stellar combat record, the 92nd Division became, as Du Bois later described it, the storm center of the Negro troops. Racist white commanders and deliberate neglect from the War Department doomed the performance of the division from the start, while its Black officers, Du Bois's shining examples of talented 10th manhood and racial leadership, endured humiliation after humiliation. African Americans could point to several notable battlefield triumphs and moments of racial pride. But for most Black soldiers, the war for democracy that Du Bois had so enthusiastically championed had devolved into a personal hell. As the end of the war neared, Du Bois, his credibility tattered, his leadership in question, sat in the most precarious position of his otherwise illustrious career. Then, quite unexpectedly, an opportunity presented itself, one that would profoundly impact Du Bois's life for the next 2 decades. At the October 1918 Board of Directors meeting, the NAACP proposed that Du Bois spearhead production of a book on the history of the Black experience in the war. He leapt at the opportunity. The scholar in Du Bois was intrigued, but more important, here was a chance for redemption. As a way of demonstrating his continued ability to organize and lead, he envisioned the book as a collaborative effort. He had 2 co-authors in mind. Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life in History, and Emmett J. Scott, the former secretary to Booker T. Washington, who had recently served as a special assistant to the Secretary of War. But Du Bois's influence had its limits. Woodson, arguably the most prominent African-American historian in the nation, next to Du Bois, of course, insisted on receiving sole credit for the project. Scott, arguably the most influential African-American in the government during the war, had plans to write his own book. At stake was the right to call oneself the historian of the Black experience in the war and the leadership stature that went along with it. Undaunted, Du Bois set his sights on France, where, as he would later write, the destinies of mankind center. On December 1st, 1918, Du Bois departed from Hoboken, New Jersey, as part of the official press delegation accompanying President Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference at Versailles. Du Bois spent 3 months in France. He organized a landmark Pan-African Congress in February 1919. His principal mission, as he described it, however, was to conduct research for the NAACP war history. He toured the battlefields and saw the trenches where soldiers of the 92nd Division fought in the final hours of November the 11th, before the armistice went into effect. He visited the encampments and experienced, as he recalled, a touch of war. Most important, he talked with Black soldiers and officers, with military intelligence following his every move, treating him like a German spy, as he described it. Du Bois absorbed tale after tale of discrimination, slander, and abuse inflicted upon Black servicemen at the hands of the American Army. A longtime friend, Matthew Virgil Boutte, was his guide. Boutte was a captain in the 92nd Division who had been constantly humiliated by his fellow white officers, court-martialed on false charges of inefficiency, seriously injured in combat, and placed, despite his officer status, in a segregated hospital ward with regular enlisted men. He entrusted his diary to Du Bois, where in one emotional entry he scrawled, "No nation on earth has ever hated a group as the Americans hate Negroes." "Never in my life have I heard such an astounding series of stories," Du Bois wrote from France in a January 1919 letter to his NAACP colleagues. "You have not the faintest conception of what these men have been through. It is not only astonishing, but it will arouse every ounce of sympathetic blood in your veins." These are Du Bois's words. He knew what needed to be done. "I can say solemnly and without hesitation," he wrote, "the greatest and most pressing and most important work for the NAACP is the collection, writing, and publication of the history of the Negro troops in Du Bois returned to the United States enraged, embarrassed, and determined. He cannot help but to question if his decision to encourage Black people to throw body and soul into the war effort had been worthwhile. He channeled his frustrations along with the anguish of the African-American servicemen he encountered in France into the post-war issues of the crisis. In the May 1919 issue, he informed readers about his mission in France, exposed the racism of the U.S. Army, and defended the honor of Black troops. The highlight, however, was returning soldiers, as his words would serve as a rallying cry for African Americans in the aftermath of the war. We return from fighting, we return fighting. History would be Du Bois' central battlefront in the struggle over the meaning of the war. Most American Negroes do not realize that the imperative duty of the moment is to fix in history the status of our Negro troops, he wrote in an editorial announcing his plans to produce the study of the Black experience in the war. To assist in this cause, he tasked readers of the crisis and Black soldiers in particular to, quote, help in the compilation of this history. Letters, diaries, photographs, official military documents, and personal memoirs quickly flooded Du Bois's office. Du Bois promised that his book, which he tentatively titled The Negro in the Revolution of the 20th Century, would appear by the fall of that year. Black veterans hoped that Du Bois would tell their story. Du Bois intended to serve as their voice. Generating further excitement, Du Bois published an essay toward a history of the Black man in the Great War, a tantalizing preview of the larger book he planned to write. He declared, "There is not a Black soldier who is glad he went, glad to fight for France, the only real white democracy. Glad to have a new, clear vision of the real inner spirit of American prejudice. The day of camouflage is past." Du Bois' certainty would be severely tested throughout the summer of 1919. From Washington, D.C., to Chicago and Phillips County, Arkansas, race riots and full-scale massacres exploded throughout the country. The number of lynchings skyrocketed. Black veterans found themselves quite literally fighting for their lives. James Weldon Johnson labeled these bloody months the Red Summer. The horror of the summer was seared into Du Bois' memory, as he would remember 1919 as a year of, in his words, extraordinary and unexpected reaction. Du Bois used his 1920 book Darkwater to reflect on the war, its appalling aftermath, and his own growing disillusionment. He minced no words. In the chapter titled The Souls of White Folk, Du Bois wrote, "Let me say this again and emphasize it, and leave no room for mistaken meaning. The World War was primarily the jealous and avarice struggle for the largest share in exploiting darker races." Du Bois also asked a remarkable question. How great a failure, and a failure in what, does the World War betoken? Asking this question in 1920. On both a personal and intellectual level, it was a question that he had to answer. Du Bois therefore committed himself to the NAACP War Project. He devoted significant time throughout much of 1920 and into 1922, often writing late into the night, past his usual bedtime of 10 p.m. He was very meticulous about going to bed on time. Drafting several potential chapters for what he confidently believed would be the definitive history of the Black experience in the war. Still exhilarated from his Pan-African Congresses of 1919 and again in 1921, he wrote chapters on the experiences of Black troops in the French and British armies, as well as a chapter ruminating on the future of the African diaspora in the wake of the war. Du Bois's early chapter drafts also reflected an attempt to try and find redemptive value in the global catastrophe and his place in it. This was clear in a chapter titled The Challenge, which summarized the difficult choices African Americans and himself faced in supporting the war. For a moment, and it was but a moment, it passed, but for a moment the country seemed to rise to its mightiest stature, he wrote. Addressing his disillusionment, he reflected, I have been called bitter. I am bitter. But here I saw all the hurts, the tears, the pain, as in one country, and that country was mine. Du Bois was glad that at least for this one brief emancipatory moment, he could call himself an American, that he and the race could, in his words, think with the nation and not as a mere group. We could rise to mighty selfishness, the nation, our country, the allies as champions of the little hurt folk, democracy. The only way that he could explain his delusion was to plead temporary insanity. We were mad. That is the only word for it. We were mad, and let it not excuse us to say that the madness was divine. But he still refused to admit that he was completely wrong. How in the end did all this set with our inner problem? He pondered. After all, it was not a mere bargain. It was a moving wish. Du Bois pressed ahead to finish his book. He held out hope that despite a lack of financial support and numerous other commitments and distractions, future book projects, crisis editorials, speaking engagements, Pan-African Congress, a nasty feud with Marcus Garvey, that his book would soon be completed. But the worsening conditions facing African Americans and other peoples of African descent throughout the diaspora caused him to further question the war's individual and collective meaning. And then there was personal tragedy. In January of 1922, Du Bois lost his closest Black friend, the man who best embodied the quest to reconcile race and country, Colonel Charles Young. Young was the highest-ranking Black officer in the Army and Black America's military hero. Think of Colin Powell, before there was Colin Powell. He had been unjustly retired from active service during the war for dubious health reasons, to prevent him from becoming a general. It broke his heart. The Army conveniently reinstated him after the armistice and assigned him to Liberia. He would die in a Nigerian hospital. Over a year after his death, Young's body was finally returned to the United States and buried with full honors in Arlington National Cemetery. But Du Bois cannot forgive the government for what he described as the inexcusable crime of sending Young to Liberia. For if Charles Young's blood pressure was too high for him to go to France, Du Bois wrote in an editorial, why was it not too high for him to be sent to the even more arduous duty in the swamps of West Africa? God rest his sickened soul, Du Bois seethed, but give our souls no rest if we let the truth concerning him droop, overlaid with lies. This ugly reminder of the war's legacy further validated Du Bois's new title for his book, The Black Man and the Wounded World. As the title reflected, Du Bois's initial hopes of the war as a potentially revolutionary moment in the reconstruction of global race relations had evolved into an interpretation of the conflict as one of the darkest moments in modern world history. The war was a global tragedy that, along with laying the seeds for future wars, strengthened white supremacy and furthered the economic exploitation of peoples of African descent. No surprise then that he described the war in the opening chapter of his book manuscript as a scourge, an evil, a retrogression to barbarism, a waste, a wholesale, a wholesale murder. Du Bois's public announcement in 1924 of the Black Man and the Wounded World sparked renewed public interest in his book. Encouraged, he began to write again. By 1926, he had drafted the bulk of his envisioned chapters. The book, finally, seemed on the verge of completion. But he needed help. He had a massive manuscript. It was approximately 700 pages at this point. Judged by his high standards and artistic standards, still required significant work. Without time and editorial assistance, he felt that he could not adequately complete the project. Seeking support, he sent inquiries to nearly every major philanthropic organization: the Rockefeller Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Slater Fund, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, the Carnegie Endowment. All expressed courtesy interest in Du Bois's project, but all ultimately offered their regrets. But beyond the practical obstacle of financial support, Du Bois faced an even bigger and more daunting challenge: himself. If the war he had supported was indeed a failure, as he pondered as early as 1920, with no positive outcome, then perhaps his book, languishing and in limbo, was destined for a similar fate. As he agonized over what to do with his book, many of the same veterans who had once viewed Du Bois as a savior now started to grow restless and requested the return of the personal letters, photographs, memoirs, and other ephemera they had loaned him so many years ago. One of them, James Johnson, a Harlem attorney and a former sergeant in the 92nd Division, even threatened to take Du Bois to court to get his stuff back. Facing the threat of a lawsuit and public humiliation, Du Bois found the time to locate Johnson's items and return them, but the majority of Black veterans were not as fortunate. Du Bois's guilt about his decision to support the war continued to gnaw at him. In 1930, Du Bois participated in a published discussion for the magazine The World Tomorrow on the war guilt debate, if Germany was solely responsible for the war and if American intervention was justified. In his reply to the editor, Du Bois admitted to being, in his words, swept off my feet during the World War by the emotional response of America to what seemed to be a great call to duty. The cost had been high. Instead of a war to end war or a war to save democracy, we found ourselves during and after the war descending to the meanest and most sordid of selfish actions. And we find ourselves today nearer moral bankruptcy than we were in 1914. Then, surprisingly, but again with a disclaimer, he admitted, "I'm ashamed of my own lack of foresight." This is Du Bois. "I'm ashamed of my own lack of foresight. And yet, war is so tremendous and terrible a thing that only those who actually experience it can know its real meaning." Du Bois was willing to acknowledge his error in supporting the war, but still sought to rationalize his decision by casting himself as one of the war's countless victims. It was not his fault. Never content to remain unproductive, Du Bois turned to other projects, including, with the aid of a 2-year Rosenwald Fellowship, Black Reconstruction in America. The war, however, stayed on his mind. In a letter to Alfred Harcourt proposing Black Reconstruction in 1931, Du Bois informed the editor, quote, "I'm going to add next year as a second volume, The Black Man and the Wounded World. That is the part which Negro troops took in the World War and its significance for the world today." Harcourt responded to Du Bois that the proposed study on Reconstruction, quote, "promises a really interesting book," but he made no mention of the book on the World War. Following the 1935 publication of the groundbreaking book, Black Reconstruction, Du Bois returned to its envisioned follow-up, The Black Man and the Wounded World. A glimmer of hope appeared in March of that year when he secured a $600 grant from the Social Science Research Council. By this time, Du Bois's politics had moved further to the left, and he began to envision The Black Man and the Wounded World as an explicit lesson about the horrors of modern warfare. A trip around the world in 1936 brought even greater clarity to the book's new significance. Thanks to a fellowship from the Overlander Trust, Du Bois spent 7 months abroad. First, visiting Hitler's Germany during the height of the Summer Olympics in 1936. Then China, and finally, Imperial Japan. He returned to the United States in December of 1936, having seen firsthand the seeds of the next World War. The need for his book could not have been any more urgent. He wanted people to see that the still open wounds from the last World War promised an even greater disaster in the near future. In his mind, it was now or never. Hoping to finally put the project, along with the ugly memory of the war itself, behind him, Du Bois reached out to the American Philosophical Society in March 1937. I began my work in this field as a conventional study of the Negro as a soldier in the World War, he wrote. But over time, as he explained, the whole theme has been expanding and developing in my mind, more especially since my trip around the world in 1936. He now conceived the book, in his words, on a much broader and more important scale. If only he could have, as he pleaded to the American Philosophical Society, leisure and opportunity to finish this work, I think I can do something which will have influence on future knowledge with regard to war and colored people. He thought about $7,500 would be sufficient. The American Philosophical Society denied his request. He received one final rejection in March of 1940 from the Social Science Research Council, just as Hitler prepared the German army to invade France. Du Bois, disillusioned, disheartened with a Second World War, a tragic reality, abandoned hope that he would finish and publish his book. Despite an investment of more than 20 years, despite a manuscript over 800 pages in length, The Black Man in the Wounded World, Du Bois's epic history of the Black experience in the First World War would never see the light of day. So this could very well be the end of the story. But we are left with the question of why. First, the million-dollar question. Why didn't Du Bois finish The Black Man in the Wounded World? In my humble opinion, I believe that Du Bois suffered from intellectual shell shock when it came to writing about and rationalizing a war defined by its irrationality. In his semi-autobiographical 1940 book, Dusk of Dawn, he wrote, "In my effort to reconstruct in memory my thought in the fight of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People during the World War, I have difficulty in thinking clearly." Du Bois, difficulty in thinking clearly? What's going on here? He would go on to lament that the whole history of the American Negro and other Black folk in the World War has never been written. He recalled his time in France and the mass of documents, as he described him, that he had collected over the years. They deserve publication, not simply as a part of the Negro's history, but as an unforgettable lesson in the spiritual lesions of race conflict during a critical period of American history. By the 1940s, it was clear that the spiritual lesions caused by the First World War had not healed. World War II confirmed the failure of World War I, as well as Du Bois's decision at the time to place his moral and political credibility on the line in encouraging Black people to close ranks and support America and the Allies. Indeed, Du Bois's own wounds had not healed as well. In a 1941 letter regarding his alma mater, Fisk University, possibly taking a position on American preparedness to enter World War II, Du Bois wrote, I have lived through one period of deliberate and prolonged propaganda for war and partially succumbed to it. Adding, I have lived to know better. And my opposition to war under any circumstances has been immeasurably increased. But even up to the final years of his life, Du Bois still sought to understand why he had supported the war in the first place. I felt for a moment, this is in his posthumously published autobiography, I felt for a moment, as the war progressed, that I could be without reservation a patriotic American. He went on to add, I'm not sure that I was right, but certainly my intentions were. I did not believe in war, but I thought that in a fight with America against militarism and for democracy, we would be fighting for the emancipation of the Negro race. With the armistice came disillusion. That disillusion stayed with Du Bois until his death on August 27, 1963, in Accra, Ghana. The war consumed Du Bois. It confounded him. He cannot make sense of it as both a personal and historical moment. He was unable to muster the intellectual fortitude and, dare I say, the moral strength necessary to complete his book. His failure embodied the tragedy and failure of the war he struggled to write about. In this sense, the black man in the wounded world was Du Bois himself. But we are also left with the question of why does this story matter? Well, it matters because Du Bois matters, right? Anything about Du Bois matters. He remains arguably the greatest black intellectual this country has ever produced. Just as we rightly celebrate his genius, we must also understand his humanity. Someone who hoped and dreamed, someone capable of making the wrong decision, someone capable of failure, and someone who changed. The failure of World War I and ultimately the failure to complete The Black Man in the Wounded World were essential to his political evolution and his radicalism. By the late 1940s, he became a staunch peace activist and, in the eyes of the federal government, in the midst of the Cold War Red Scare, a threat. In 1951, he was indicted and tried on charges of being an agent of a foreign principal. He won an acquittal, but the ordeal and subsequent seizure of his passport by the government were a painful reminder that for a black person, criticizing America and fighting for peace came with tremendous risk and cost. In his book, published in 1952, titled In Battle for Peace, Du Bois wrote, "As then a citizen of the world, as well as a citizen of the United States of America, I claim the right to know and think and tell the truth as I see it. I believe in socialism as well as democracy," he wrote. But above all else, he declared, "I hate war." But I believe this story also goes beyond Du Bois. It reveals to us the impact of World War I on African Americans, how it exposed the core tensions of African American identity, and how it shaped the history of racial struggle in the 20th century and up to the present. For Du Bois, the history of World War I was not simply an intellectual challenge. It was a profoundly personal, moral, ethical challenge as well. It still is. Du Bois understood that the history of the war was deeply bound with the political status of black people, the future of democracy, and the condition of the world we live in. It still is. More than a century after the First World War, many of the same struggles Du Bois confronted: white supremacist violence, creeping fascism, wealth inequality, modern forms of voter disenfranchisement, right-wing assaults on the truth, exorbitant government spending on the military, preparation for endless war. These still remain urgent matters today. Du Bois, through his life, his work, and his voice, has indeed tasked us with fighting for democracy and working with all of our strength to heal our still wounded world. Thank you. Now the fun part, Q&A. Let's go. Oh, I know something's got smashed. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you, Professor, for that lecture. I would be interested in any thoughts you would care to share about some of what's in that 800-page manuscript that hasn't been published.
It's a lot to go through. Yeah. It's really a remarkable archive, and a remarkable example of Du Bois in progress. You look at this manuscript, again, which he worked on over a 20-year period, you really get a glimpse of his evolving thought process, but also Du Bois as a writer. How meticulous he was, how he would literally cut and paste onto the page. It's a glimpse into how he thought about the war, how his thoughts about the war evolved over time. It's a diasporic history, which he talks about the experiences of African troops, as I said, in the French and British militaries, thinking about the implications of the war for the African diaspora. It's a history about what it means to be Black and the challenges of supporting a country that does not support you, right? The tensions of Black patriotism and loyalty that he personally wrestled with. But ultimately, it's a story about the experiences of African American troops, and he goes into great detail, chronicling every aspect of their experiences. The manuscript itself is, quite frankly, a mess. Some of the chapters are quintessentially Du Bois. He actually published the first chapter in the crisis in 1924. So some of the chapters just kind of sing with Du Bois's voice and analytical and conceptual force. Others are literally cut and pasted notes on the page. Others are just kind of sketches. So in terms of its actual publication quality, it definitely had a lot of work to do. And Du Bois knew that. He knew he had a massive manuscript on his hands. And that was part of the problem, right? The enormity of the history that he was trying to tell and his own complicated place in it. Trying to make sense of that was, in my opinion, ultimately too much, even for the great Du Bois to grapple with. Yes?
So how much of your book mirrors his manuscript, or do you get a taste of the manuscript in it, or is it also about how you see Du Bois in putting it together?
More of the latter. I mean, I certainly try and talk about the manuscript itself, analyze some of the chapters, pull some excerpts from it. So you get a little glimpse of the manuscript itself. But I am, my advisor at the time of graduate school, when I encountered this manuscript in all of my naivety, I want to publish Du Bois's manuscript for him. She was like, no, you're not. You're going to finish your dissertation. So I would never be so bold to think that I could complete Du Bois's book for him. I try and present it as best as I can. But my book is really the story behind this book, the story of Du Bois trying with all of his might to write this book, to get it completed, and ultimately not being able to. What that tells us about Du Bois's relationship to the First World War, what it tells us about the significance of World War I to Du Bois's life, his work, his political evolution, and ultimately the significance of the war to African Americans and the broader struggle for democracy and freedom in the 20th century. Yes?
Yeah, the parts of that manuscript, but I've had a look at it. There's a lot of contrast between the way the French officers treated the black men of America in the war and what happened to them under the American officers. And interesting, yet the French actually gained territory in Africa as colonial after the war. And I wonder if he ever wrote about that. Because he really defends, as your quote shows, the French relationships with the black troops.
Yeah.
And I just, it's a question I've had.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's part of Du Bois's growing disillusionment with the legacies of the war. When he's initially supporting the war in 1918, when he goes to France in 1919, he is enamored with the idea, the possibilities of democracy, what democracy would look like. And he's juxtaposing France and the United States, the absence of democracy in the United States for black people, the treatment of African American troops compared to the treatment that African American troops received in the French army and the treatment of African colonial troops in the French army. In some ways, Du Bois was blinded by this idea of French racial egalitarianism, right? And part of that was due to his disgust with American racism and seeking different alternatives to what democracy could potentially look like, right? So he kind of latched on to this imaginative ideal of France as this exemplar of democracy, which of course it wasn't, as evidenced by its nasty colonial history, right? And its investment, right, in the continued exploitation of African peoples on the continent, as well as peoples of color throughout the world. So I think by certainly the 1930s and certainly by the 1940s, Du Bois was very critical of the colonial, he's always critical of the colonial system, but I think his critique was even more profound. You think of a book that he wrote, Color and Democracy, right, which he's very clear that this is going to be my life focus, right, addressing the problems of colonialism and empire, which France was a part of. So I think that legacy of continued colonial exploitation, right, of empire on the part of Europe and America was a major factor in his growing disillusionment with the war. Yes?
I have a question from Arthur McFarland, Du Bois' great-grandson, who's watching in Hawaii. Hi, Arthur.
Oh my goodness. Hello.
What impact?
Okay, now I'm nervous.
What impact did his experience with the war have on his views of subsequent wars?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in trying to write this book about Du Bois, it just kept getting longer and longer. Not surprising, anything written about Du Bois is going to be long. But I realized that it's really a story that spans one world war to the next, that you can't understand Du Bois's views during World War II, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, where he commits himself to the peace movement without really understanding the roots of that. Like, how did he get to this point during World War II and its aftermath of being such a staunch anti-war activist to the point where the federal government is ready to throw him in jail, right? He learned the lessons of World War I, right? His experience, his disillusionment with World War I really shaped his political evolution and his anti-war convictions. Yes, that.
I have a question from Houston, Texas, from our scholar in residence, Phil.
Is that Phil?
Yeah, right, yeah.
Tell Phil I'm going to talk to him tomorrow.
Okay, yeah. He asked in the meantime, just to elaborate a little bit on the materials. How much of it did he return? Did he really end up keeping the bulk of the material from the soldiers and veterans? And
Yeah.
if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, that's really a fascinating and actually kind of heartbreaking piece of this story. There's an individual who I didn't get a chance to talk about in the presentation, who I talk about in the book, Adam Patterson, who was an officer in the 92nd Division, he was initially going to be one of Du Bois's co-authors of this book. He envisioned himself as being one of the co-authors, and he contributed several potential chapters to the manuscript. He rallied other Black soldiers and officers to send Du Bois their materials, and Du Bois, for lack of a better word, dissed him. He felt that this was his book alone. He refused to return Adam Patterson's materials, as well as many of the other materials that Black veterans had lent to him, promising that the book is going to be coming out one of these days. Don't worry. When the book comes out, I'll make sure to return your stuff to you. So a lot of those materials, most of those materials are still sitting in an archive at Fisk University. So there's, I think, some really interesting and complicated ethical questions related to this project and to Du Bois's actions in particular. He was incredibly selfish. His ego was, as we probably know, formidable, for lack of a better word. And he believed that this was a history that was his. He kind of took ownership of it at the expense of literally dozens and dozens of Black soldiers and officers who invested their own hopes and historical visions into him, only to have it not reciprocated. Yes?
What was his immediate reaction to the Trotter criticism? You know, he obviously, you've shown that his thinking evolved once he went to France and everything.
Yeah.
But was he defensive? Was he, did he take?
Well, according to how Du Bois described it in The Crisis, he said, I'm paraphrasing, all of this controversy has left me in unruffled serenity. These are his words. So he claimed that it didn't have any effect on him, right? This was just the price to pay for being a leader, for trying to lead the masses and their stupidity. But without question, the criticism stuck, absolutely. And he writes about this in subsequent writings, right? He questions, who was I, who had been demanding African Americans to fight against segregation, to advocate for a segregated officers training camp? Who was I to ask African Americans to forget their special grievances when he had been trying to bring those grievances to the forefront of the nation? So by the 1930s and 40s, and as I said, even by the end of his life, he's still questioning that decision to close ranks, to call for African Americans to close ranks. So I think a lot of those criticisms definitely hit their mark.
Why did the military intelligence officer thing break down?
So there's a lot of tea behind that. So essentially, the criticism that Du Bois started receiving reached such a crescendo that the military, the War Department, came to the conclusion that it was not a good idea to move forward with this plan. There was actually another Black intelligence officer, Walter Loving, who was kind of working behind the scenes to stir up the controversy because he didn't want Du Bois and Joel Spinger kind of encroaching on his territory. So there was kind of all this behind the scenes machinations and stuff. Du Bois was definitely conflicted about it, but ultimately it was kind of this perfect storm of pressures, him wanting to serve his country, serve his race, not wanting to disappoint Joel Spinger, who was his closest friend and one of his benefactors. The reality that the federal government was starting to press down on the crisis through the Sedition Acts. So he was in a precarious place, and he thought this would be the right decision, but he very quickly realized that it was not a good idea. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes as well. Questions? No? We're good? Oh, yeah, sure.
You
You answered this already by saying that the parts of the manuscript are a real mess, so perhaps it would be a disservice to Du Bois to publish it in the state it's in. Is it also a disservice to the Black servicemen to not publish it? Is there, do the materials and make it into the manuscripts to the degree that it would benefit?
You know, I think,
their
again,
legacy?
that's one of those, I think, ethical questions that maybe I would have to work through in thinking about what to do with this manuscript. You know, even though Du Bois, wherever he is, would probably say, this is not publishable, well, as is, don't even think about publishing this. I think it's a really remarkable glimpse into Du Bois as a writer, would give us insight into how Du Bois, you know, thought, and how he evolved. So I think there are opportunities, hopefully, opportunities to publish this really, or pieces of this really remarkable manuscript and archive. You know, what that would look like, what that would consist of. You know, I think there would still need to be a lot of conversations and considerations from a lot of various people here at Fisk, elsewhere. But as you said, also the contributions that Black soldiers and veterans made. I imagine that there are families out there who would love to see these materials. I mean, it's remarkable. Diaries, personal letters, photographs. I mean, he collected dozens and dozens of portrait photographs of Black soldiers. Just a really remarkable archive that, again, I think larger conversations about its significance and the ethics surrounding it should definitely take place.
Your book might spark some of those.
Yeah.
We'll see, hopefully.
Arthur says publish.
Right.
All right.
Oh, yeah, sure.
What do you want to next after this? Is it more Du Bois or?
Oh, absolutely not. No. I mean, I imagine that Du Bois will always be with me. He's everywhere. He's inescapable. Kind of remains to be seen. I'm interested in maybe kind of looking at the really remarkable kind of diasporic community